Hello, everyone. So for my synthesis project, I'm analyzing the forms, goals, and effects of patriotic education, and notably seeing how it could be implemented and have different goals and effects at different levels of the American education system. For example, how the goals or the forms of patriotic education might be different depending on if it's focusing on the student or the teacher or the school system or society as a whole. And ultimately, what I found is that although the form of implementation might be different at various levels, the effects of it by and large are the same. So, in contrast to the stated goals of patriotic education to foster national unity and national pride, generally patriotic education tends to foster exclusion and intolerance, encourage obedience and an inherent trust and respect for established authority, and it discourages questioning and the critical examination of the sources and structures of power in contemporary America. So I start my synthesis off, or my analysis off, with a look at the ideology behind patriotic education. To that end, I rely primarily on an analysis of the reformed Texas social studies content standards that were implemented in 2011 by the Texas State Board of Education, as well as the 1776 project or the 1776 report that was prepared and published this past January as a part of the Trump administration's goal of implementing patriotic education in American public schools. And ultimately, looking at the ideology behind patriotic education, there are two pretty clear objectives behind it. The first of them being American exceptionalism, or the desire to instill in students the notion of American exceptionalism. And this manifests itself in a number of different ways. Generally, in curricular guides, there's an emphasis on favoring and highlighting what these sources refer to as the core universal principles that the United States was uniquely founded upon. Basically arguing that the principles described in documents like the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution are core and universal principles, and that the United States is unique in being the only country in the world that is truly founded on them and has those principles at the root of its politics, society, and culture. To that end, or to that end as well, American exceptionalism generally tends to encourage an exclusion or a disregard of other views, other countries, and other cultures. But also the way it's typically implemented, it generally excludes different groups here in the United States as well. Generally, there's a heavy emphasis on the accomplishments and the achievements of white Christian men, while lip service is generally paid to the achievements and the history and the experiences of people of other races, religions, or genders. And in that sense, there's a misrepresentation of history when it's approached from the mindset of needing to support American exceptionalism. Notably, certain aspects are overstated, while other aspects of American history that might undermine the notion of American exceptionalism, things like slavery, imperialism, they're generally minimized or tried to be, or attempted to be explained away. The second major ideological trait I've found is that overall there's this emphasis on cultivating a respect for established authority and institutions of power. Notably within these curricular guides and the way patriotic education has been implemented, there's a noted absence of critical examination of capitalism or the nature of American political institutions. Generally, capitalism and the structure of the American government and politics are assumed to be unchangeable and the best they can possibly be. Within this strand of respect for authority, there's also a correlation with the growing militarization of American society, in that generally schools and curricular, particularly during times of war, have historically been notably pro-war, and that they've taken steps to ensure that their students are being instructed with a pro-war, pro-military ideology. And when it comes to competing beliefs or views that might advocate for change or reform to some of the core institutions of American society, these are generally disregarded, if not outright demonized. Prime examples would be rather explicit condemnations of the notion that the Constitution is a living document that can and should evolve over time as society changes, or social democratic programs like the New Deal. Whereas in some instances, in some of these documents, like the 1776 report of the Texas Standards, there's rather explicit condemnation or criticism of these ideologies, and encouraging that students be taught to critically examine these ideologies while not critically examining more established beliefs and systems. So, looking at how patriotic education impacts the different levels of education, if we look at how this impacts the learner, generally students are overwhelmingly taught to respect authority, and all different types of authority, from more explicit types of authority like the government or the military, but also more personal forms of authority like schools and their parents. Students also generally do not really receive an effective history education, because they're presented with a misrepresentation of history that kind of glosses over a lot of aspects and misrepresents certain parts of American history. And kind of going along with that, based on the objectives of patriotic education, students are generally, their critical thinking skills are typically not developed. Instead, there's just this emphasis on just trusting the established source of authority and information. Students, long term, there's a potential that they could learn intolerance, primarily for other countries and other cultures, but there's also a pretty good potential that they could just disregard or be unaware of the experiences and achievements of other groups here in the US. And if we're looking at, in particular, students of low socioeconomic background as well, they are more likely to be targeted by military recruiters in schools to join the military. Looking at the teacher, the biggest effect that patriotic education has on the teacher is that it drastically minimizes academic freedom. There is a long history in the US of teachers who have encouraged critical looks at the institutions of power in the US to be fired by school boards or administrators who disapprove of such criticism. Most common during times of war, but again, this goes way back to World War I, and it's continued ever since, with teachers being disciplined or fired because of their encouragement of criticism. So this has the result of, again, minimizing academic freedom and discouraging critical teaching. At the school system as a whole, patriotic education generally encourages the school environment to be more authoritarian and also serve as a form of assimilation of culturally distinct groups. Again, this is another facet that has a long history in the United States, going back to previous waves of Irish and Italian immigration, continuing up till now and through now. The school system also is impacted because of the impact it has on the resources it provides and the type of instruction it endorses and supports for teachers, which will ultimately shape the type of instruction that the students receive and that the teachers provide. Prime examples would again be the textbooks the schools provide that may or may not have an American exceptionalist slant to them. Lastly, if we look at society, patriotic education generally encourages nationalism, which generally serves to discourage reforms to American institutions or to American society, even if such reforms could potentially benefit the country or alleviate a lot of injustice and oppression or inequality. And in general, it discourages criticism or questioning of the established sources and structures of power, and ultimately serves to keep those structures in place and perpetuate the status quo. So, what is the significance of these findings? What should we make of it? Ultimately, I argue, and there are a number of sources that kind of support this, a redefinition of patriotic education. I think there are a number of attributes that we could convey through education that could be effectively labeled as patriotic education, but we need to reframe what those would be. Probably most interesting of these, there is a source I found that argues that we should, instead of encouraging like nationalism or national pride, we should instead encourage civic virtue. And by that, what the source means, he is defining good citizenship as requiring active, engaged, informed, and responsible citizens. And schools can contribute to that by encouraging students to be active, engaged, informed, and responsible, and to think critically about the world, so that way they actually participate in a meaningful way in American democracy. And another important way we need to reframe this is that we need to, while we need to make students aware of nationalism, we need to provide them with a solid history education and an awareness of the realities of American history, which will ultimately make them more aware of historical and present day injustices and make it more likely that they will recognize and act to change those injustices in the future. So I know I've gone over a little bit, but there's a lot that I'm trying to do. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to seeing what everyone else is up to.